From the moment Caitlin Clark stepped onto a professional court, it became clear that she wasn't just another promising rookie. She was the type of athlete who bends entire industries around her presence. Most players enter the WNBA hoping to earn a solid contract and gradually build their reputation over several seasons. Clark skipped that process entirely. Her rise wasn't slow, steady, or predictable. It erupted. Almost overnight, she became the most talked-about figure in women's sports, the center of every highlight reel, and the undisputed driver of the league's biggest financial boom in decades. What makes her ascent even more astonishing is not just how quickly it happened, but how dramatically it changed everything around her. Before she had even played a minute of pro basketball, you could already feel the shift. Brands lined up before the draft, executives competed for meetings, and ticket sales spiked in every city predicted to host her. The story of Caitlin Clark wasn't just about basketball talent. It was about timing, influence, personality, and a level of market pull that the WNBA had never experienced before. While typical rookies earn around $60,000 and rely on small sponsorships to supplement their income, Clark entered the league with a kind of economic leverage that veteran stars had chased for years. She didn't negotiate like a rookie hoping to prove herself. She negotiated like a global superstar who already knew her value and wasn't afraid to demand recognition that matched it. Her early professional trajectory looked more like the career path of a once-in-a-generation entertainer than an athlete adjusting to league life. Whenever Clark stepped into an arena, the building filled. Whenever she appeared in interviews, the viewership spiked. Whenever she was mentioned in headlines, social media exploded with reactions, debates, and viral discussions. Broadcasters fought for rights to air games connected to her. Stadiums reported record-breaking attendance numbers, not just slightly higher than usual, but massive surges that transformed the energy of entire markets. Local businesses surrounding the arenas saw increased traffic, restaurants stayed packed long after games ended, and merchandise stands sold out of anything remotely connected to Clark's name. But the most telling part of her rise wasn't the money or the fame, it was the way she changed perceptions. For years, conversations about the WNBA staying financially limited dominated sports culture. Critics repeatedly argued that women's basketball simply didn't generate enough interest or revenue to support major contracts or big endorsements. Clark obliterated that narrative. She proved that the issue was never talent or entertainment value. It was exposure, marketing strategy, and the willingness to invest in the right figure at the right moment. Her popularity didn't build gradually. It detonated, sending shockwaves through the entire sports landscape. By the time she finished her first handful of professional games, she was already being compared to cultural giants far outside of basketball. She didn't just capture sports fans. She captured people who hadn't watched a WNBA game in years. Parents saw her as a role model. Young athletes saw her as a blueprint. Brands saw her as a marketing phenomenon. And the league saw her as the superstar who would finally unlock the financial potential they had been trying to reach for a decade. But Clark's meteoric rise didn't come without consequences. Whenever someone ascends this quickly, it disrupts hierarchies, creates tension, and exposes insecurities that had been quietly simmering under the surface. While many players celebrated the new attention she brought to the league, others felt overshadowed, overlooked, or replaced. Some wondered why years of hard work hadn't given them the recognition Clark earned so effortlessly. And a few veterans, especially those who had previously been considered the faces of the league, began feeling that uncomfortable pressure that comes when someone new completely resets the standard. Clark didn't intend to shake the league's internal dynamics, but she did. And not everyone handled it gracefully. The first real fault line in the league began forming the moment Clark's earnings became public. The numbers weren't just impressive, they were earth-shattering. For years, WNBA players had accepted the reality of modest rookie contracts, limited exposure, and endorsement deals that rarely crossed six figures unless you were already an established star. But Clark walked into the league with leverage so massive that it immediately redefined what rookie potential looked like. When her first-year earning projection hit the internet, $8.1 million, the reaction across the sports world was explosive. And inside the league, the mood shifted in ways no one could ignore. The financial contrast was impossible to overlook. Rookie salary in the WNBA is barely enough to build long-term stability. The minimum hovers around $64,000, and even top draft picks like Clark only earned slightly above that through league pay. But Clark wasn't relying on her league salary. Not even close. Her income was almost entirely driven by off-court power, a reality that only a handful of male athletes ever get to experience. To players who had spent years grinding through overseas seasons, off-season leagues, and constant travel just to make ends meet, watching a newcomer enter the league with life-changing wealth felt like a direct threat to the unwritten hierarchy that had defined the WNBA for decades. It wasn't that veterans didn't want Clark to succeed. Many were genuinely proud to see women's basketball finally getting financial respect. But beneath the positivity was a different emotion, one that grew stronger every time Clark made headlines for another multimillion-dollar deal: frustration. Veteran stars had carried the league through its slowest years, often working under intense pressure to promote the sport with limited resources. They had fought for higher wages, better facilities, and more national attention. Yet none of that effort had given them anything close to the earnings Clark was bringing in after only a few appearances. This was the moment the divide became impossible to deny. Clark's presence forced the league to confront a sensitive truth: that influence, not tenure, dictates financial power in sports. Brands didn't care how long someone had been in the league. They cared about reach, impact, marketability, and potential to drive profit. Clark checked every one of those boxes with ease. And while her success opened doors for future rookies, it also exposed just how undervalued many longtime players had been for years. Some players accepted it as part of the business. Others couldn't help feeling slighted. The whispers started quietly. Why does she get this much? What makes her more valuable than players who have been dominant for seasons? How does a rookie earn more than two-time MVPs? It wasn't jealousy in its simplest form. It was the emotional collision between fairness, ego, legacy, and economics. Watching someone earn multiples of your income before proving themselves on the professional stage can spark resentment in even the most disciplined athlete. Veterans began speaking more openly about respect, paying dues, and earning your place. While none directly mentioned Clark, the subtext was loud enough that fans didn't need help connecting the dots. Some framed it as a concern about league values. Others insisted it wasn't about money but about balance. But for the first time in years, the WNBA found itself facing internal tension that had nothing to do with competition on the court. Clark's unexpected earning power didn't just disrupt the economics of the league, it disrupted the psychology. It created a new dynamic where rookies could suddenly outperform veterans not only in popularity but in financial influence. And for some established stars, that shift felt like a threat. The league had changed overnight, and the players who once dominated the spotlight were now forced to share it with someone who hadn't even finished her first season. The money wasn't the only issue, it was the message. Clark's earnings signaled a new era where the traditional path to recognition no longer applied. She was the beginning of a new blueprint, one that rewarded immediacy, cultural impact, and cross-platform engagement. And while that thrilled brands and excited fans, it left certain veterans feeling like their years of work had been overshadowed by the arrival of a single transformative figure. For some players, especially those used to being the center of the league's attention, that shift wasn't just uncomfortable, it was infuriating. When Caitlin Clark's rise first started dominating headlines, most veterans kept things professional. They congratulated her, acknowledged her impact, and celebrated the attention she was bringing to the league. But Aya Wilson's reactions began standing out early, not because she said anything openly hostile, but because everything she didn't say carried more weight than what she did. Her public behavior gradually formed a pattern, one subtle enough to deny but obvious enough that fans couldn't ignore. It wasn't one moment or one comment that exposed her frustration. It was the slow, steady stacking of reactions that revealed a deeper resentment brewing underneath. The first cracks appeared around the time Clark signed her historic Nike deal. It was the kind of contract players dream about. 8 years, $28 million, and more exposure than any WNBA athlete had ever received. As the sports world exploded with praise, Wilson posted cryptic messages about earning things the right way and respecting the veterans who built the league. She never mentioned Clark by name, but the timing made the implication impossible to miss. Fans immediately connected the dots, and the posts quickly turned into conversation starters about whether Wilson was bothered by the attention Clark was receiving. Then came the social media shifts. Wilson began uploading old photos with Nike staff, highlighting her own history with the brand, almost as if she needed to remind the world that she had relationships too. Relationships that existed long before Clark stepped onto the scene. She posted throwbacks to her signature shoe launch, something she had rarely highlighted in the past. The sudden surge of shoe-related content felt oddly forced, especially considering how quiet she had been about it before Clark's endorsements took over headlines. As Clark's popularity kept skyrocketing, Wilson's posting habits became even more revealing. Her Instagram stories gradually turned into indirect commentary on the media hype surrounding Clark. One day it was a post about real impact, the next about sustained excellence, and another about not confusing attention with achievement. She insisted these were general messages about the league. But the timing, always right after Clark did something newsworthy, told a different story entirely. Her online responses weren't the only subtle signs either. When Time magazine announced their Athlete of the Year award, Clark's name was everywhere. Players across the league wrote heartfelt congratulations, long messages about her influence, and paragraphs about how she was reshaping the game. Wilson posted a single short sentence. No excitement. No warmth. No personal message. Just a bare minimum acknowledgement that looked more like an obligation than genuine celebration. And fans noticed. Fast. They compared it to her previous posts celebrating other players, posts filled with passion, support, and long captions that showed she truly cared. Clark's post? Cold, clipped, and unmistakably distant. Things escalated when Wilson's own signature shoe sales started struggling. Reports surfaced that her models weren't moving units while anything connected to Clark was selling out immediately. Stores couldn't keep Clark's merchandise in stock. Meanwhile, Wilson's line collected dust on shelves. Suddenly, her social media was filled with posts showing off her shoes from every angle, heavily tagged, heavily captioned, and heavily promoted. It was a stark shift from her previous behavior, and fans once again drew their own conclusions. Even Wilson's speaking engagements became part of the pattern. For years, she had attended corporate events without highlighting them online. But after Clark's appearance fees became public knowledge, numbers rumored to exceed some players' entire season salaries, Wilson started posting behind-the-scenes content from her own events. Backstage photos, mic check videos, captions emphasizing her professional value. It felt like she was trying to prove she was still relevant in spaces Clark was exploding into. Her messaging about the sport also took on a noticeable tone. She began emphasizing the veterans who built this league, not being fooled by hype, and earning your stripes. Every comment seemed harmless on its own, but collectively they painted a clear picture of someone struggling to accept a dramatic shift in spotlight distribution. To fans, to analysts, and even to players quietly liking or reposting certain content, the message felt obvious. Wilson didn't want to share the throne. The resentment wasn't about Clark's talent. Wilson had no reason to doubt Clark's ability. The issue was what Clark represented, a complete rewriting of the league's power structure. Clark became the new face of women's basketball almost instantly, a status Wilson had spent years building toward. Watching someone else take that position in a matter of months was something Wilson simply wasn't prepared for. Her reactions, the subtle jabs, the lukewarm congratulations, the defensive posts, revealed a veteran who felt her influence slipping away. She saw the wave of change rolling in, and instead of riding it, she pushed against it. But the harder she pushed, the more obvious her frustration became. Clark never asked for the spotlight. She just earned it. And Wilson's responses made one thing painfully clear. Not everyone was happy about that. Caitlin Clark's endorsements weren't just impressive contracts. They were seismic events that reshaped the entire business model of women's sports. Before Clark, endorsement deals for WNBA athletes were respectable but limited, usually topping out at modest six-figure arrangements tied to local campaigns or seasonal promotions. But Clark stepped into the league and immediately started signing partnerships that looked nothing like the norm. These weren't the typical rookie support packages. These were deals built for global icons, the kind of contracts usually reserved for athletes with a decade of professional dominance behind them. Clark entered the WNBA with financial power that players usually earn after long careers, and that imbalance created a shockwave that made the entire league recalibrate what was possible. The Nike deal was the first major sign that Clark's career was going to follow a completely new template. 8 years, $28 million guaranteed, plus bonuses, marketing opportunities, and product lines that gave her a level of brand influence no WNBA player had ever touched. People underestimated how groundbreaking that deal was. Nike didn't just hand her a contract, they positioned her as a long-term centerpiece in their global strategy. It wasn't about supporting a rising star. It was about investing in someone who could move markets, change demographics, and redefine the brand's presence in women's sports. What made this deal even more disruptive was its timing. Clark signed it before she had even completed her first professional season. For the first time in league history, a rookie held more commercial value than nearly every veteran combined. Athletes who had been fighting for larger endorsement opportunities suddenly had to watch a newcomer leapfrog them into financial security. And the envy wasn't about the money alone, it was about what the money represented. Clark didn't just earn wealth. She earned status. She became the athlete brands viewed as the future, the figure who could unlock new markets, and the one whose face could sell products far beyond the basketball space. The Nike deal alone would have been enough to cause tension, but Clark didn't stop there. Gatorade came next, offering her a partnership normally reserved for athletes like LeBron James, Serena Williams, Lionel Messi, individuals whose cultural influence transcends their sport. Gatorade doesn't just sign players. They select people who can shape generations, athletes whose impact extends into lifestyle, youth culture, and national marketing campaigns. The moment Clark appeared in Gatorade's advertising ecosystem, it signaled something major. She had crossed into a tier no WNBA player had ever entered. This partnership did more than elevate Clark, it exposed the gap between her and the rest of the league. For veterans who had spent years establishing themselves, seeing a rookie placed in a category reserved for global icons wasn't easy to accept. Clark wasn't just being promoted, she was being crowned. And the message was loud. Brands believed she had the potential to reshape women's sports in ways no previous player had accomplished. But the most symbolic endorsement was the deal with Wilson Sporting Goods. The company hadn't offered a signature athlete partnership in basketball since Michael Jordan. They bypassed decades of players, legends, and champions to make Clark the new face of their basketball division. Her appearance on sports equipment, from basketballs to retail displays, marked a turning point in how the industry viewed female athletes. Millions of young athletes were now seeing Clark's face the same way previous generations saw Jordan's. That comparison alone pushed Clark into a category of influence that even many male athletes haven't reached. Clark's economic dominance didn't end with major brands. Speaking engagements became another unexpected revenue source. Companies that typically booked CEOs, industry leaders, and high-profile entertainers suddenly wanted Clark on their stages. Her appearance fees climbed higher than the salaries of some WNBA players, a reality that amplified the growing divide between her and the rest of the league. While rookies were budgeting groceries and finding ways to stretch their league income, Clark was building a financial empire that stretched far beyond basketball. Corporate America wasn't investing in her for her basketball alone. They were investing in what she represented, a cultural moment. She had the rare combination of appeal, relatability, competitiveness, and viral magnetism that brands dream about. Her social media engagement was unmatched. Her every appearance created buzz. Her every partnership expanded into new audiences. Companies realized Clark had tapped into demographics that had historically shown little interest in women's sports. She made the WNBA cool in spaces it had struggled to enter. This was the moment everything changed for veterans. Their frustration wasn't just jealousy, it was fear. Fear that the standard had shifted. Fear that the league had a new golden child. Fear that no matter how long they had been grinding, they would never match the commercial power Clark had effortlessly achieved. Clark's endorsement empire wasn't just a financial story, it was a shift in identity for the entire league. She became the symbol of a new era, one where commercial value no longer followed seniority but cultural impact. And while that opened opportunities for the next generation, it also created deep insecurities among players who felt the spotlight drifting away from them. Clark didn't set out to threaten anyone. But her rise forced everyone else to confront a difficult truth. The game had changed, and she was the one changing it. When Forbes released its annual list of the most powerful women in sports, No one expected the rankings to shake the league the way they did. The list has always carried weight, not just because of the names it features, but because of the methodology behind it. Forbes doesn't measure hype. They measure numbers. Real numbers. Earnings, brand value, cultural impact, corporate influence, social reach, and economic ripple effect. When they place someone high on that list, it is a statement backed by data, not opinion. And in 2025, the data painted a picture that was impossible to deny. Caitlin Clark wasn't just a rising star. She was the single most influential athlete in her entire league, landing at number 4 on the global list and ranking above icons who had been building their brands for decades. Her placement wasn't just surprising, it was historic. Clark became the highest-ranked athlete on the list, surpassing tennis champions, Olympic legends, and internationally recognized superstars who had spent years cultivating their global presence. The fact that a WNBA rookie managed to outperform these long-established giants sent shockwaves through the sports world. It wasn't just a personal achievement. It was a shift in power. Forbes highlighted the key factors behind Clark's ranking. Her $8.1 million in earnings wasn't simply impressive. It signaled a drastic revaluation of women's basketball. Her social media engagement wasn't just high. It was outperforming athletes with larger followings and more established fan bases. Her ability to draw new audiences into the sport wasn't anecdotal. It was measurable. Attendance data showed surges that cities hadn't experienced in decades. Broadcast rights saw bidding wars anytime Clark was involved. National advertisers prioritized her games, resulting in the highest commercial demand the WNBA had ever seen. But the most jaw-dropping part of her ranking came from Forbes' analysis of economic impact. Clark didn't just make money for herself, she made money for everyone around her. Teams hosting the Indiana Fever saw increases in tourism, restaurant traffic, merchandise sales, and transportation usage. Local businesses reported revenue spikes on game days that mirrored the effect historically reserved for star-driven NBA matchups. Clark brought an energy that didn't just elevate the league, it lifted entire communities. Forbes noted that Clark drove nearly 27% of the WNBA's total economic activity during the 2024 season, an unheard-of number in any major sport. No rookie had ever done that. No veteran had ever done that. It was the type of impact usually associated with once-in-a-generation athletes who fundamentally changed the business landscape of their sport. And Clark did it before she even finished her second year. The list also emphasized her cross-sport recognition. Her participation in Pro-Am golf tournaments created waves of coverage. Sports networks featured her not just when she played basketball, but when she appeared in any athletic setting. She attracted attention from audiences who didn't even follow the WNBA. The mainstream media treated her like a cultural figure, not a league-specific star. This level of crossover appeal was something Aya Wilson had never achieved, despite years of trying to expand her influence beyond basketball. The explosive nature of Clark's impact made her Forbes placement feel inevitable. But to veterans who had spent years fighting for recognition, it felt like a symbolic moment, the final confirmation that Clark was officially the face of women's sports. And for Wilson, that confirmation hit harder than any endorsement announcement or merchandise report ever could. When the list dropped, Wilson's reaction spoke volumes without saying a word. Instead of celebrating Clark's accomplishment with enthusiasm, she offered a short, clipped acknowledgement. No warmth, no excitement, no pride for what this meant for the league. It felt obligatory, as if she was forced to recognize the accomplishment but refused to endorse the meaning behind it. Fans immediately compared her response to the lengthy, emotional posts she had written about other athletes' successes. The difference was undeniable. And the silence that followed was even louder. No follow-up post. No deeper commentary. Just distance. Cold, unmistakable distance. What made the situation worse for Wilson was the timing of her own brand struggles. Reports had already surfaced about underperforming merchandise sales. Her signature shoe wasn't moving. Her partnerships weren't trending. Meanwhile, Clark was selling out entire product lines in hours. Seeing Clark celebrated by Forbes, a publication known for tracking only the strongest, highest-impact earners, poured fuel on a fire that had been smoldering for months. Forbes didn't just recognize Clark's rise. They validated it. They gave it authority. They backed it with data. And data doesn't care about seniority, resume, or past achievements. It only cares about results. Wilson could argue with media narratives. She could argue with fan opinions. She could argue with online comparisons. But she couldn't argue with Forbes numbers. Clark's placement wasn't just a ranking, it was a declaration. It said that the league had changed. It said that the new era wasn't coming, it had already arrived. And it said that every measure of influence, revenue, and cultural power pointed to one conclusion. Caitlin Clark was now sitting at the top. For Wilson, that was the moment everything boiled over. The frustration that had been building quietly, the defensiveness, the subtle jabs, the forced social media posts, all became impossible to hide. Forbes had made the shift official, and there was no going back. Caitlin Clark's rise didn't just shake the league financially. It reshaped the cultural landscape around women's basketball in a way no athlete of her generation had ever managed. The WNBA had seen stars before, talented players who dominated the court and earned respect from fans, analysts, and critics alike. But Clark was different. She didn't just perform well, she shifted the cultural center of gravity. Suddenly, people who had never watched a WNBA game were tuning in. Kids were wearing fever jerseys to school. Families were planning vacations around game schedules. Local news stations covered her like a hometown hero, even if she wasn't from their city. And this universal, borderless enthusiasm didn't sit comfortably with everyone. Clark's influence wasn't built on traditional metrics like championships or seniority. It was built on something far more unpredictable: magnetism. People connected to the way she played, aggressive, confident, bold, and unapologetically competitive. They connected to her personality, her interviews, her viral moments, her authenticity, and her willingness to embrace the spotlight while keeping a grounded, relatable energy. Most importantly, they connected to the feeling that she represented a changing era, one where young fans finally had someone who felt modern, accessible, and aligned with the digital age. This shift created a cultural divide. For years, veterans like Aya Wilson were the faces of the league. They carried the weight of representing women's basketball through its tougher seasons. They built their reputations through consistency, leadership, and long-standing loyalty to the league. They were respected, deeply respected, and they believed they had earned their place at the front of the movement. But when Clark arrived, the conversation changed almost instantly. Overnight, the spotlight redirected from a collective of established stars to one rookie who commanded global attention with ease. What made this especially difficult for certain players was the way Clark's influence extended into demographics the WNBA had never fully captured. Young boys who traditionally only watched NBA games became Clark fans. Suburban families who barely followed sports started watching Fever games together. College students formed fan sections that followed her across the country. Even international audiences, who usually gravitate toward Olympic-level icons, began paying attention to regular-season WNBA matchups because Clark was involved. Veterans noticed this shift immediately. They saw the audience changing, and with that, the league's priorities shifting. Suddenly, marketing campaigns weren't centered around long-standing personalities. They were built around Clark's imagery, Clark's voiceovers, Clark's narratives. Broadcasters spent more time analyzing her development than highlighting veterans' contributions. Social media accounts posted Clark highlight reels daily, sometimes overshadowing other players' major achievements. Clark didn't just become popular. She became the reference point for every conversation about the league's future. And that's where the tension became unavoidable. For Aya Wilson and others who had dedicated years to elevating the WNBA, this felt like a painful rewriting of history. It wasn't that they disliked Clark personally. Most had never had issues with her as an individual. It was the symbolism of her rise that created friction. Clark represented change. She represented youth, modernity, and a reshaping of what marketability meant in women's sports. She represented a new blueprint where dominance wasn't measured only by championships, but by reach, influence, and cultural sway. This was the part that stung the most. Clark's influence stretched far beyond basketball. She appeared in golf tournaments, attended major cultural events, and was featured in mainstream entertainment segments usually reserved for Hollywood celebrities. Her crossover appeal placed her in rooms where even the WNBA's biggest names had never been invited. Brands didn't just view her as an athlete, they viewed her as an all-purpose cultural asset. The deeper issue was the fear that Clark's rise could overshadow years of effort from players who had fought to build the foundation she now stood on. Veterans wanted credit for their contributions, their struggles, their advocacy, and their resilience during the years when the league lacked major support. They expected Clark's success to be seen as part of their legacy, not a replacement for it. But public perception moved fast, and the more Clark dominated the cultural conversation, the further some veterans felt pushed into the background. Wilson was the loudest example, but she wasn't alone. There were unspoken tensions across the league, subtle comments in interviews, passive-aggressive posts, and quiet frustrations about the league's shifting priorities. Clark's impact grew so quickly that there wasn't time for everyone to adjust. In the span of one season, she changed what the WNBA looked like, who watched it, how it was marketed, and how players were valued. She represented a new era where influence wasn't earned through slow accumulation, it was captured through cultural resonance. And for veterans who had championed the league for years, watching someone else become the symbol of its future was a tough pill to swallow. Clark didn't try to threaten their status. She didn't compete for their attention. She simply existed at a moment when culture was ready to embrace someone exactly like her. But that didn't make the shifting spotlight any easier for those who felt it slipping away. As Clark's influence continued exploding far beyond the boundaries of the basketball world, the tension bubbling beneath the surface finally began taking on a clearer shape. And nowhere was that pattern more visible than in the behavior of Aya Wilson. It wasn't a single moment that exposed the growing resentment. It was the accumulation of dozens of subtle decisions, reactions, posts, and comments that formed a picture too defined to ignore. Fans didn't need insider information to see what was happening. The pattern was public, and it was unmistakable. Wilson had always been outspoken, confident, and unapologetically proud of her accomplishments. She carried herself like someone who knew her value, and rightfully so. But once Clark entered the spotlight, something changed. The timing of her posts, the tone of her interviews, and the careful selection of her messaging all suggested that Clark's rapid rise wasn't sitting as comfortably with her as she wanted the public to believe. One of the clearest indicators was Wilson's sudden obsession with veteran recognition. Before Clark joined the WNBA, Wilson seldom talked about tenure or hierarchy. She focused on performance, leadership, and team identity. But once Clark started breaking viewership records, selling out arenas, and dominating national coverage, Wilson began leaning heavily into narratives about respecting the players who built the league, not confusing hype with long-term impact, and remembering who paved the way. While these statements may have sounded noble on the surface, the timing made them feel pointed. It was as if she was drawing an invisible line between the established stars and the new generation, and Clark was the unspoken target. Another piece of the puzzle appeared in Wilson's sudden fixation on statistical comparisons. She began posting graphics highlighting veteran accomplishments, streaks, milestones, and achievements that she felt weren't getting enough recognition. These posts were strategically released right after major Clark moments: a record-breaking broadcast, a viral clip, a trending endorsement, or a high-profile accolade. She never said Clark's name directly, but the implication was clear: don't forget who the real stars are. Her commentary during interviews also exposed the tension. When asked about the media frenzy surrounding Clark, Wilson often responded with carefully measured phrases like, "It's great for the league, but players shouldn't be overlooked," or "Hype comes and goes, excellence remains," or "It's important not to hand out crowns too early." None of these comments were inherently negative, but together, they shaped a narrative suggesting she felt Clark's attention wasn't fully deserved yet. The pattern grew more noticeable when Clark merchandise started flying off the shelves. Retailers couldn't keep her jerseys in stock. Her logoed basketballs sold out faster than they could be manufactured. Meanwhile, Wilson's products, including her own signature shoe, saw far slower movement. Instead of accepting the market shift, Wilson pivoted hard into self-promotion. She posted photo shoots featuring her shoes, old promotional campaigns, and behind-the-scenes images from her launch events. Fans noticed that the tone of these posts was noticeably different. They felt defensive, almost competitive, as if she was trying to reclaim attention that had drifted away. Another major sign came through her interactions with teammates and other players. She started liking and sharing posts that subtly criticized the media for overhyping certain players or ignoring long-term consistency. She amplified messages that contradicted Clark's growing narrative, sometimes in ways so specific that fans immediately took screenshots and circulated them across social platforms. These weren't coincidences, they were clear signals. But the most obvious indicator of her feelings appeared during major award announcements. Whenever Clark achieved something significant, Wilson's reactions were shockingly muted. This stood in stark contrast to the enthusiastic, heartfelt, multi-paragraph posts she usually shared when other players, even rivals, received accolades. Her silence wasn't just noticeable. It was strategic. Every athlete has moments of frustration. Every player deals with jealousy, insecurity, and competitive pride. But the reason Wilson's behavior stood out wasn't because she felt those things. It was because she displayed them publicly. And she displayed them consistently. The pattern became too obvious to deny. She was struggling to accept that the league's spotlight, attention, and cultural momentum had shifted dramatically towards someone much younger, much newer, and much more socially influential. This wasn't just about basketball. It was about relevance, status, and legacy. Wilson had spent years believing she was the centerpiece of the WNBA's branding, the face of its future, and the leader of its evolution. Watching Clark become the center of national attention in a matter of months felt like having the foundation she'd built kicked out from under her. And instead of adjusting gracefully to the new landscape, she pushed back in every subtle way she could. The truth is simple. Wilson didn't want to admit that a rookie had surpassed her in influence. Not in skill. Not in accolades, not in leadership, but in visibility, the currency that determines the future of modern sports. And the more Clark rose, the more Wilson struggled to hide her discomfort. The pattern was there, in her posts, her comments, her behavior, and her reactions. It revealed a reality many fans sensed but few players dared to say out loud. Aya Wilson wasn't just bothered. She was threatened. Caitlin Clark's influence goes far beyond her scoring, her confidence, or her highlight reel moments. What truly unsettles certain veterans is what she symbolizes. Clark represents a shift in the sports world that many players weren't prepared for. A shift where visibility, marketability, and cultural resonance matter just as much as championships or long-term dominance. And for athletes who spent years climbing the ladder the traditional way, this new reality feels like a threat to everything they thought they understood about success. Clark became the embodiment of a new model. One where personality, reach, and generational appeal drive opportunity more than seniority or resume. She didn't wait 10 seasons for brands to notice her. She didn't need multiple MVPs before companies viewed her as a centerpiece. She didn't have to win a championship before becoming the face of an entire league. She arrived ready to launch into superstardom. And the world responded instantly. This is what scares certain players. It redefines the rules. For decades, women's basketball followed a predictable structure. Athletes spent years grinding, working overseas to supplement their income, building their reputation slowly, and earning recognition only after persistent effort and sustained excellence. Veterans believed that was the only path, the honorable path. But Clark bypassed that system entirely. She didn't reject it, she simply didn't need it. Her talent, personality, and cultural timing aligned so perfectly that she elevated the entire sport in one explosive leap. To players like Aya Wilson, this represents a direct challenge to the idea that legacy is built step by step. Clark's rise suggests that legacy can happen fast. Not because someone is better, but because the environment is finally ready to embrace a star who fits the modern blueprint of influence. Clark also represents something deeper, a financial revolution. She disproved the idea that female athletes can't earn significant endorsement money. She disproved the claim that rookies have to wait their turn. She disproved the notion that the WNBA can't attract massive commercial partners. Her presence alone created a new economic ecosystem that didn't exist before she stepped onto the court. That kind of disruption isn't just exciting, it's intimidating. For players who had been working tirelessly to push the league into mainstream attention, Clark's instant impact feels like a rewriting of history. They fear that the years they spent battling for visibility will be overshadowed by Clark's era-defining arrival. And it's not just veterans who feel the tension. It's the league itself. Clark forced every executive, every broadcaster, every advertiser, and every brand to rethink their strategies. She became the cornerstone of marketing programs, streaming schedules, sponsorship deals, event planning, and national promotions. Industry leaders didn't simply promote her, they pivoted around her. That level of power is rare for any athlete, but for a rookie? It's almost unheard of. And that unprecedented shift created a sense of urgency and insecurity among established stars who once held the majority of the league's influence. Another reason Clark scares some players is because she brings in audiences who don't follow the traditional fan culture. These aren't long-term WNBA supporters or deeply loyal franchise followers. These are new fans, young people, families, digital-first consumers, and even sports viewers who normally stick to men's leagues. Clark's presence drew them into the WNBA for the first time, creating a fan ecosystem that doesn't respond to traditional metrics of seniority or resume. To brands, these new fans matter more. To networks, these viewers matter more. To the league office, these numbers matter most. And suddenly, Clark became the focal point of league strategy. That means more televised games, more marketing dollars, more sponsorship opportunities, and more long-term planning built around her trajectory. Players who spent years positioning themselves as the faces of the league now see those roles shifting towards someone a decade younger. That's not jealousy, that's fear. Fear of being replaced. Fear of being overshadowed. Fear of becoming a footnote in a story they helped write. Clark also represents cultural crossover in a way the WNBA has rarely experienced. Her appearances in golf tournaments, her widespread mainstream recognition, and her influence in entertainment spaces show she isn't just a basketball star, she's a cultural figure. That's the kind of status that elevates a league. But it also reshapes the hierarchy inside it. And for veterans who once sat at the top of that hierarchy, it feels like the ground beneath them is shifting. Clark didn't aim to disrupt the landscape. Her success simply created a new one. She didn't try to overshadow anyone. The world just gravitated toward her naturally. She didn't attempt to steal the spotlight. The spotlight followed her all on its own. She represents the future of women's sports. Fast, modern, culturally powerful, digitally driven, and commercially undeniable. That's why some players are scared. Clark's presence proves that the old rules are gone. The league has entered a new era, and not everyone is ready to let go of the past. Caitlin Clark's rise isn't just a sports story. It's a cultural shift that reshaped the entire foundation of women's basketball. In just a short time, she went from a standout college phenom to one of the most influential athletes in the world, driving economic change, cultural relevance, and massive audience growth that the WNBA had never seen before. She became the spark that set off a new era, one driven by modern influence, digital reach, and the undeniable power of fan engagement. And with that rise came the reactions. Admiration from millions, excitement from brands, and resentment from players who suddenly felt their status slipping through their fingers. Aya Wilson's behavior throughout this transition made something clear. When a new powerhouse arrives, not everyone adjusts gracefully. The subtle digs, the lukewarm congratulations, the carefully timed posts, all of it reflected a veteran who wasn't just watching a rookie thrive, but watching her own position in the spotlight slowly fade. And no matter how she tries to frame her comments or hide the tension, the pattern speaks for itself. Clark didn't steal the spotlight. She earned it. She didn't create the shift. She was the shift. What Clark represents is bigger than basketball. She is proof that women's sports can generate massive revenue, draw millions of viewers, and create cultural icons who command global attention. She shattered outdated expectations and forced the world to look at the WNBA through a new lens. One where profitability, marketability, and cultural crossover are not just possible, but powerful. She's the kind of athlete who redefines the expectations of a generation and pushes the entire industry forward, even if it makes some players uncomfortable in the process. The tension between Clark and Wilson is more than rivalry. It symbolizes an internal battle between the old structure and the new era, a clash between the players who built the foundation and the athlete who is rewriting the rules in real time. Clark's rise shows what happens when timing, talent, and cultural momentum collide to create a force too strong to ignore. And whether the critics like it or not, she's only getting started. As the next season approaches, the world is watching. Fans want to see how Clark continues shaping the league. Brands want to see how far her influence can reach. And players like Wilson are waiting to see whether they can reclaim their place in a spotlight that has shifted almost entirely toward one rookie. It's a moment of transition, tension, and undeniable excitement, and the outcome will define the future of women's basketball for years. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Someone who wants deep dives, real stories, and the truth behind the headlines, not just the surface-level noise. And because this channel is still growing fast, your support genuinely changes everything. So before you click away, do us a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button, tap the like button, and drop a comment down below. Not only does it help this video get recommended to more viewers, but every subscriber pushes the channel closer to reaching the audience it deserves. If you want more investigations, more breakdowns, and more powerful stories just like this one, subscribing is the best way to make sure you never miss out. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Why do you think Wilson reacts this way to Clark's success? Thanks for watching, and get ready. The next story is already on the way.